Hey, it's good to see you again. Or if this is your first time here, welcome. Now let me ask you something. Have you ever looked at a rich, powerful family and thought, wow, they have it all? The money, the connections, the influence? But what if I told you that behind all of that, there's often something much darker? A history that doesn't show up in magazine covers or commercials. Today we're talking about a family you've definitely heard of, even if you didn't know much about them, the Guinness family. Yes, like the beer. But trust me, this story has nothing to do with brewing and everything to do with grief, scandal, obsession, trauma, and yes, maybe even a curse. Because the Guinness legacy isn't just rich in history, it's soaked in tragedy. So, grab a drink, whatever kind you like, and get ready. Because this isn't just a history lesson. This is a warning about what happens when success becomes a prison and when a name becomes something you can't escape. This is True Crime Echoes, and this is the dark history of the Guinness family. Chapter 1: The Pint That Came with a Curse. You know, I never thought I'd say this, but behind every smooth pint of Guinness, there's a story that's anything but smooth. It's dark, messy, and depending on who you ask, maybe even cursed. See, when we think about powerful families that shaped the world, we usually think about royalty politicians or maybe even the Kennedys if you're from the US, but in Ireland, there's a name that holds just as much weight, if not more, and that's the Guinness family. Yep, that Guinness, the same one your ex probably drank a little too much of on St. Patrick's Day. At first, I thought, okay, they made beer, they got rich. The end. Right. But once I actually started digging into the Guinness legacy, oh no, honey. This was so much more than just beer. This family didn't just brew alcohol, they brewed drama, scandal, tragedy, and what seems like a generational curse that makes the Kennedy family look like amateurs. We're talking freak accidents, addiction, betrayals, kidnappings, and an eerie number of tragic deaths, all orbiting one of the most iconic brands in the world. And while they were building a business empire, they were also laying the foundation for generations of heartbreak. But here's the twist: despite all the tragedy, they were also celebrated for their generosity, their patriotism, their philanthropy. Some even call them national heroes. So what happens when wealth, legacy, and trauma all live under one very grand, very haunted roof? That's what we're about to explore. This is the story of how a family made billions off barley and may have paid the ultimate price for it. So pour yourself a pint, unless you believe in curses, and let's talk about the dark, complicated history of the Guinness family. Because behind every empire, there's always a cost. Chapter 2: Arthur Guinness and the 9,000-Year Dream. So let's go back to where it all started. Before the scandals, the funerals, the whispers of a curse, there was just one man. His name, Arthur Guinness. Now, Arthur wasn't born into luxury. He came into the world in 1725 in a small Irish town called Selbridge. His family working class, the kind of people who started working with their hands before they could even spell their own names. And Arthur was no different. He worked alongside his father in a malt house. That's where beer begins its journey, if you didn't know. And yeah, it wasn't glamorous. It was labor. But it taught him everything. He saw firsthand how beer was made, how it was sold, and more importantly, how people needed it, not just for a good time, but for a living, for survival. In those days, clean drinking water wasn't always a given, but beer was safe, beer was social. And for Arthur, beer would become a ticket out of obscurity. Here's where it gets interesting. When the local landowner, the guy who employed Arthur's family, died, he did something almost unheard of. He left both Arthur and his father £100 each in his will. Doesn't sound like much now, right? But back then, that was like handing someone a down payment on a brand new life. And Arthur took it. He and his brother used that inheritance to buy a struggling little brewery outside of Dublin. Not exactly a sure thing. At the time, Irish breweries were getting crushed by imports from England. But Arthur had this stubborn confidence. Maybe it was madness, maybe it was vision, but he believed he could stand out. Not just by brewing beer, but by brewing Irish beer, something local people could take pride in. And guess what? It worked. Fast. Arthur's beer was rich, dark, and unlike anything people were used to. It was bold, it had character, and it made money. A lot of money. He used those profits to invest in real estate, flour milling, and even insurance. But his biggest move came in 1759 when he signed what might be the wildest lease deal in business history. He leased a property called St. James's Gate, which would become the heart of Guinness beer. And instead of your usual 5 or 10-year lease, Arthur signed one for, get this, 9,000 years. Yeah, 9,000 years. For the tiny sum of £45 a year. Now, I don't know about you, but when someone signs a lease that outlives entire civilizations, that's not just a business move. That's a statement. Arthur wasn't just building a brewery, he was building a dynasty, a legacy that he believed would stand the test of time. And it did. But while his business was booming, Arthur's personal life was a little more complicated. He married a wealthy woman named Olivia Whitmore, who wasn't just rich, she was well connected. She had ties to the Irish government, which, let's be honest, was probably a huge boost for the family. Together, they had 21 children. Yeah, 21. But out of those 21, 11 died before reaching adulthood. It's horrifying, but sadly, it was common back then. Infant mortality was high, and medicine practically non-existent. Still, I can't imagine the emotional toll. Success in one hand, and unimaginable grief in the other. It's a theme that would follow the Guinness family for generations. Now Arthur wasn't just a businessman and a father, he was also a political player. And this is where things start to get murky. He fought hard to reduce the tax on beer in Ireland, arguing that beer was a safer, healthier alternative to hard liquors, like gin and whiskey, which were ravaging poor Irish communities. And honestly, he had a point. But here's the twist. While he framed it as a public health crusade, it was also a strategic business move. Lower beer taxes meant higher profits for him, and some say his arguments weren't entirely altruistic, that he used public health as a way to protect and expand his empire. He also had to navigate the tricky politics of Irish identity. Ireland was still under British rule at the time, and Arthur had to toe the line. He wanted to appeal to Irish drinkers without alienating the British crown. Some even say he spied on his fellow Irishmen during the 1798 rebellion and passed info to British authorities. Nothing ever confirmed, of course, but the rumors linger. And yet, despite the controversies, Arthur was still loved. He was known for treating his workers well, offering fair wages, even housing. In an era where factory owners were often ruthless, Arthur seemed, at least on the surface, like a different kind of leader. He died in 1803 at the age of 78, and he left behind a thriving business, a massive family, and a very big shadow. The Guinness name would live on, but so would the tragedies. Arthur had built the foundation for an empire, but the people who inherited it, they'd carry more than just wealth. They'd carry the weight of his ambition, and maybe something darker. Because this is where the curse begins to whisper. And trust me, it gets worse from here. Chapter 3. Profit and the Potato Famine. You know, when someone builds a legacy as powerful as Arthur Guinness did, the next generation usually has two options: maintain it or try to outshine it. Benjamin Guinness, Arthur's grandson, chose the second one, and let me tell you, he did it, but not without controversy. By the time Benjamin took over the family business in the early 1800s, Guinness was already a household name in Ireland. But Benjamin, he was thinking bigger. He wanted international reach. He had his sights set on England, even though, let's be real, Ireland and England were anything but friendly back then. Despite the tension, Benjamin made some very smart, some might say ruthlessly smart business decisions. And before long, the Guinness empire exploded. In fact, Benjamin ended up making more money than his grandfather ever dreamed of. But that wealth, it came at a very dark cost. Let's rewind a little bit. In 1845, Ireland was hit by a tragedy that would change the country forever: the Great Potato Famine. A fungus, this nasty little plant disease, swept through the crops and decimated the potato supply. And in Ireland, potatoes weren't just food, they were survival. Millions of people relied on them to eat. Over the next several years, more than 1 million people would die of starvation. Another 1 million were forced to emigrate. Families were torn apart. Entire towns emptied. It was one of the most heartbreaking humanitarian disasters in Irish history. And while all of that was happening, guess who was thriving? Yeah, the Guinness family. See, the main ingredient in Guinness beer is barley. And unlike potatoes, barley crops weren't hit as hard by the blight. The family owned massive fields of barley all across Ireland. And instead of using that grain to help feed the starving population, or even brewing cheaper beer for the locals, they did the opposite. They protected those barley fields with armed guards, literally men with guns. They made sure the harvest was kept safe, processed, and shipped out, but not to Irish citizens. No, the barley went to England, where it brought in massive profits. Now I get it. This was business. Supply and demand. The Guinness family had contracts. They had shareholders. But at the same time, how do you justify prioritizing exports while your own people are dying in the streets? I keep thinking about that image, mothers holding malnourished children while crates of barley were loaded onto ships headed across the sea. It's the kind of moral weight you can't ignore. But for the Guinness family, that money was power. And Benjamin used it to buy up cheap land all across the country. Land that once belonged to families who couldn't afford to pay rent, who had been evicted and left to starve. So while Ireland suffered, the Guinness empire grew bigger, wealthier, untouchable. And here's the twist. Despite all that, Benjamin wasn't completely heartless. In Irish society, the Guinness name was still respected, sometimes even admired. Benjamin funded major restoration efforts for St. Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin, one of the most iconic religious sites in the country. It was a grand gesture, a symbol of national pride, and maybe a way to repair the family's image. He even added the Irish harp, yes, the national symbol of Ireland, to the Guinness logo. It's still there today, a powerful branding move, but also a reminder, we are of Ireland, but were they? By the time Benjamin died in 1868, he was the richest man in Ireland. Guinness had become the largest brewery in the world. The family had gone from a humble malt house in Selbridge to a global empire. But beneath all that wealth and prestige was a country still grieving. And I can't help but wonder how much of that grief was tied to their success. Because sometimes the darker chapters of history aren't written in blood. They're written in contracts, exports, and silence. And in the Guinness story, this was just the beginning. Chapter 4: The Golden Guinness Girls. You know how every powerful family eventually reaches a point where the empire becomes less about building and more about enjoying. That's exactly what happened to the Guinness family. After generations of brewing land grabbing and navigating political power, they finally hit that level of wealth where they didn't have to hustle anymore. They just lived rich. And with that came the birth of the Golden Guinness Girls. Even the name sounds like something out of a Gatsby novel, right? But these were real women heiresses who grew up in lavish mansions surrounded by staff horses, gardens, and more money than they knew what to do with. And when the 1920s rolled around, the decade of jazz rebellion and wild freedom, these girls became legends. They were young, beautiful, filthy rich, and living in London, which at the time was the absolute epicenter of elite nightlife. They were part of what the media called the bright young things, a group of upper-class socialites who didn't just party, they performed it. They dressed in costumes, they crashed mansions, they drank champagne from bathtubs and kissed each other in public before it was even remotely acceptable. And right in the middle of it all, Maureen Guinness. She was the Guinness girl everyone talked about. Loud, outrageous, hilarious. If there was a party happening in London's upper crust, chances are Maureen was either throwing it or crashing it in disguise. She loved playing pranks, sometimes dressing up as a drunk Irish maid, stumbling into her own parties while serving wine in glasses that had holes in them. She'd serve fake cheese. Sometimes she'd even wear a fake penis strapped to her nose, because I don't know, apparently shock value was a vibe. And people loved her for it. They said she was witty, theatrical, and completely unforgettable. But behind all that sparkle and laughter, there was something hollow. Maureen wasn't just partying for fun, she was escaping something. And we start to see that when we look at her role as a mother. Maureen had 4 children with her first husband, who tragically died in World War II. She was left to raise them, but she didn't really raise them. According to her daughter, Caroline Maureen didn't have a maternal bone in her body. She was more interested in talking about her glory days on the party circuit than tucking her kids into bed. Caroline later described her childhood as deeply unhappy. The kids were mostly raised by nannies, who, spoiler alert, weren't exactly screened for compassion. In fact, Caroline claimed they were often neglected, sometimes not even fed. She said they'd sneak out of the estate on bikes, knocking on neighbors' doors and begging for food. Just pause for a second. These were children of one of the richest families in the world, riding around their private estate like hungry ghosts. And still, Maureen kept partying. She remarried twice. She traveled. She maintained her public image as this eccentric, glittery woman. But privately, her children were crumbling, especially Caroline. By the time she was a teenager, Caroline was stunning, intelligent, and of course incredibly wealthy. The kind of young woman society expected to marry a nice duke or maybe a nobleman. But Caroline wasn't interested in doing what was expected. She was drawn to tortured artists, to danger, to rebellion. And when she fell for Lucian Freud, the famous painter and grandson of Sigmund Freud, yes, that Sigmund Freud, she didn't ask for anyone's blessing. She ran off and married him. Maureen, of course, was horrified. A painter, really. But Caroline didn't care. She had grown up in a gilded cage, and now she wanted to tear it apart. Her relationship with Lucian was passionate and messy, and it didn't last. But it was the first in a series of complicated, sometimes destructive relationships. Caroline wasn't chasing love, she was chasing freedom. A way to feel alive in a world where she'd spent her entire childhood feeling invisible. And this is the moment when the Guinness story starts to feel less like a tale of privilege and more like a tragedy unfolding in slow motion. Because even with all that wealth, all that fame, all those sparkling gowns and cocktail glasses, the cracks were showing. Caroline's story wasn't about excess, it was about absence. An absence of nurture, of stability, of real love. And when you grow up with that kind of emptiness, eventually it finds a way to bleed out. This chapter of the Guinness legacy wasn't about brewing beer or acquiring land, it was about losing control. About a family that had everything, but somehow nothing that truly mattered. And as you'll see in the next chapter, things only get darker from here. Chapter 5. The Air of Heartbreak. Caroline and Natalia. There's something haunting about generational pain. You don't always notice it right away. It's subtle at first, maybe a cold distance, a bit of emotional detachment, or that quiet voice in your head that says, you don't matter. But if it goes unhealed, it starts to take root. And in families like the Guinnesses, where image is everything that pain hides behind silk curtains and champagne flutes until it doesn't. Caroline Guinness knew pain intimately, and not just the kind that comes from loss or heartbreak. She knew the kind of pain that starts in childhood neglect, emotional starvation, the hollow ache of knowing your mother loves parties more than she ever loved you. She carried all of that into adulthood, into her relationships, and eventually into her role as a mother. By the time Caroline had her own children, the cycle was already repeating. She loved them, I'm sure she did, but love isn't always enough, especially when you've never been shown how to give it. The truth is, Caroline was struggling, and like many people who carry unresolved trauma, she turned to alcohol. At first it was manageable, a glass of wine at dinner, maybe two. But as the years went on, and the weight of everything she had endured, the broken relationships, the social pressure, the haunting losses settled onto her shoulders, the drinking became less about socializing and more about coping. She started to fade from her children's lives, much like her mother had faded from hers. And that's where we meet Natalia, Caroline's daughter. Young, beautiful, and born into one of the wealthiest families in the world. On the surface, she had everything. But the truth, she was lost. Natalia was a product of her environment, glamour, money, freedom, but not a lot of structure. Like her grandmother Maureen, she was a party girl. The kind that turned heads in every room, the kind that people talked about the next day. But the partying wasn't just for fun, it was a distraction. A shield against the chaos that had been quietly building for generations. And then at just 18 years old, Natalia's story ended in the most heartbreaking way. It happened one night in the bathroom of her London home. She was alone preparing to inject heroin, a drug that had already stolen too many lives, especially among the wealthy and the young. No one knows exactly what happened. Maybe she slipped. Maybe she lost consciousness too fast. But she fell headfirst into a bathtub filled with water, and she never got back up. Natalia drowned at 18, in the silence of a bathroom, in a house filled with history money and shadows. I wish I could say it stopped there. But within the same year, yes, the same year, another tragedy hit the Guinness family. Lady Henrietta Guinness, Natalia's cousin, was recovering from a brutal car accident that had left her physically and emotionally shattered. Before the accident, she'd been living a picture-perfect life in Italy, married, wealthy, poised for the kind of future that looks flawless in photos. But behind the scenes, she was battling depression, and not the kind you can smile through, the kind that swallows you whole. She once said, "If I had been poor, I would have been happy." A line that makes you wince. Right on the surface, it sounds tone-deaf. But when you really think about it, what she was saying is, money didn't save me. It only trapped me further. And in 1978, Henrietta jumped from a bridge in Italy and took her own life. Two young women, same bloodline, gone within months of each other. Different causes, same despair. And when you start putting the pieces together, it's impossible to ignore the pattern. The parties, the privilege, the emotional distance, the pressure to be someone you're not. It's a cocktail of dysfunction that's been passed down like a family heirloom. For Caroline, these losses were unbearable. Her daughter, her niece, her past, all collapsing in on her. And instead of getting help, instead of stopping the spiral, she leaned deeper into the darkness. Her drinking escalated. She became erratic in public. She was banned from hotels, shunned by old friends. The once beautiful society darling was now described as disheveled, reclusive, even dirty. And again, just like her mother, she disappeared from her children's lives. The Guinness legacy was no longer just about beer or wealth or power. It had become a legacy of silence, grief, and pain no one knew how to fix. Each generation inherited more than just a name, they inherited the ghosts too. By the time Caroline passed away in 1996, she was 65. And she wasn't just a daughter or a mother or a widow. She was a symbol of what happens when trauma goes untreated, when image matters more than healing, and when no one is willing to break the cycle. But this curse, this unraveling, it wasn't over yet. Not even close. Because what happens next in the Guinness story, it gets even more bizarre, even more tragic, and somehow even more chilling. And I'll tell you all about it in the next chapter. Chapter 6. A birthday, a horse, and a fatal turn. You ever hear one of those stories that just makes you stop and think, what are the odds? Like, how could something so simple, so ordinary, turn deadly in a matter of seconds? That's exactly what happened with Rose Nevin Guinness. And to this day, I still get chills thinking about it. So by the late 1990s, the Guinness family wasn't in the headlines as much anymore, not for parties, not for politics, and not for philanthropy. But the rumors, the whispers about this so-called family curse, they were only getting louder. And then came Rose. Rose was born into the Guinness dynasty, but unlike some of her more rebellious relatives, she wasn't known for partying or tabloid scandals. Actually, she was pretty down to earth by Guinness standards anyway. Her real passion was horses. She was a skilled rider, and everyone said she had that special connection, the kind of intuitive bond that only true horse people have. You know what I mean? Like the kind of person who can calm a spooked stallion with just a voice. So in 1998, Rose was in England celebrating her mother's birthday. And like any thoughtful daughter with a flair for the dramatic, she wanted to do something memorable, something special. She decided to arrive at the celebration driving a horse-drawn carriage. Not exactly your average birthday Uber, but hey, when you're a Guinness, you don't do anything halfway. So there she was, riding a peaceful countryside road in this elegant carriage, her dog by her side, waving to neighbors, smiling calm. Just picture perfect. It was supposed to be a beautiful moment, a daughter showing up in style to honor her mother. And for a while it was exactly that, until something changed. Witnesses later said they saw the horse suddenly jerk, spooked by something no one could quite identify. A sound, maybe, a movement. Whatever it was enough to send the horse into a full-blown panic. And once a horse bolts, especially when it's pulling a carriage, there's almost nothing you can do. Rose tried to regain control. She pulled at the reins, tried to steer, tried to calm the animal down, but the horse was terrified and completely out of control. It galloped downhill, gaining speed fast, heading straight for a sharp bend in the road. And that's when it happened. The carriage hit a bump, or maybe the turn was too sharp, we don't know exactly. But Rose was thrown from her seat. And then in a moment so horrifying it almost doesn't feel real, the carriage, the one she had lovingly prepared for her mother's birthday, ran her over. She died instantly, crushed beneath the weight of the very thing she was using to celebrate life. It took 7 men to lift the carriage and recover her body. She was 42 years old. You have to understand this wasn't just tragic, it was uncanny. Rose had experience. She knew horses. She had ridden for years. This wasn't some foolish accident caused by inexperience. This was random, violent, freakish. And for the Guinness family, it felt like another cruel chapter in a never-ending book of sorrow. The local press ran with it, of course. Headlines screamed, "The never-ending curse of the Guinness dynasty." And you know what? At this point, who could blame them? One daughter overdosed. Another jumped off a bridge. And now a peaceful birthday carriage ride ends in a fatal accident. It felt like the universe was keeping a tally. But here's the part that stuck with me, the part I can't let go of. Rose wasn't making headlines for partying or politics. She wasn't running from anything. She was just trying to do something sweet for her mom. She was trying to bring joy. And somehow even that got swallowed up by the darkness that seemed to cling to her family name. By now it was no longer just a theory. People genuinely believed there was a curse on the Guinness family. A shadow passed down through bloodlines, untouched by money, immune to privilege. And if you thought it would stop here, you'd be wrong. Because the next tragedy wasn't just heartbreaking. It was something out of a thriller novel, a home invasion, a kidnapping, a ransom demand, and yet another life destroyed in the most unexpected way. That's coming up in the next chapter, and believe me, it's one you won't forget. Chapter 7. Kidnapping, Ransom, and a Fall from the Mountain. By the time the 1980s rolled around, you'd think the Guinness family had seen enough tragedy for one lifetime. Between the overdoses, the suicides, the freak accidents, how much more could one bloodline endure? But then came this story. It didn't start with a party or a horse or some rebellious socialite. It started at home, in a quiet private space. The kind of place where most people feel safe. On April 8, 1986, John Henry Guinness, a businessman and descendant of the Guinness dynasty, came home expecting a normal evening with his wife Jennifer and their children. But instead, he walked into something that sounds like it came straight out of a crime novel. When John entered the house, he found Jennifer and one of their daughters already tied up by 2 masked intruders. Jennifer had been pistol whipped, her face bloodied, and she was terrified. Within seconds, John was overpowered too. The men tied him up alongside his family. And just when you think it can't get any worse, it does. Because these weren't just robbers looking for valuables. They were kidnappers. The men demanded £2 million in ransom money. And then, just like that, they took Jennifer with them, leaving John and the others behind bound and helpless. The whole thing was terrifyingly organized, calculated, and clearly premeditated. They knew who they were after. They knew the Guinness name. What they didn't know was that John Henry wasn't sitting on an unlimited fortune. Yes, he carried the Guinness name, but he wasn't next in line for the empire. He wasn't a billionaire. Jennifer later told her captors that they had gotten the wrong person, that there was no way her husband could pay that kind of ransom. But the kidnappers didn't believe her, or they didn't care. For 8 days, Jennifer was held hostage, moved from one location to another, blindfolded, threatened, and completely unsure if she'd make it out alive. Meanwhile, the police were scrambling. The media caught wind of it almost immediately, and the press began circling like vultures. Guinness heiress abducted, ransom demanded. You couldn't walk past a newspaper stand without seeing her face. But then a break. A neighbor in one of the neighborhoods where Jennifer was being held noticed something strange, people moving in and out of a nearby home at odd hours. And one of those people looked a lot like Jennifer. They tipped off police. That led to a dramatic overnight standoff between the police and the kidnappers. It was tense, dangerous. But in the end, Jennifer was rescued, alive, physically okay, emotionally. That's another story, but she survived, and her captors were arrested and eventually convicted. So maybe you're thinking, okay, finally, something ends well for once in this family. But the curse doesn't like clean endings. Because just 2 years later, in 1988, the tragedy returned. This time with almost cinematic cruelty. Jennifer and John were on a walk with their children in the mountains of northern Wales. It was supposed to be peaceful. A bit of healing, maybe. Time in nature. Just life. But something went terribly wrong. John slipped just a misstep. Something anyone could do. But this wasn't a sidewalk or a hiking trail. This was Mount Snowdon, the highest mountain in Wales. And when John lost his footing, he fell 3,000 feet. Jennifer and their children were right there. They watched him disappear over the edge. 1 minute, he was walking beside them. The next, he was gone. After surviving a home invasion, a violent kidnapping, a public ransom demand, Jennifer was now a widow, and the children fatherless. Again, the Guinness family was making headlines, and not for their beer. And look, I know it's easy to say, oh, it's just bad luck, or every family has tragedy, but this wasn't one isolated event. This was yet another completely different, completely freakish loss, added to a growing list of bizarre, violent, heartbreaking incidents tied to one bloodline. And what gets me is how normal these moments start. A birthday ride, a walk in the countryside, a quiet night at home. That's what makes these stories so disturbing, because they're not playing out on red carpets or inside mansions. They're happening in everyday spaces to people who, despite their wealth, can't seem to escape the weight of something invisible. Some say it's generational trauma, some say it's just wealth magnifying human flaws, but others, they still whisper about a curse, a darkness that clings to the Guinness name no matter how far they run. And if you think we're near the end of this story, we're not. Because the next generation, they inherited more than just fortune. They inherited the shadows too, and one of them, she came face to face with death at just 5 years old. But unlike so many before her, she survived. That's next. Chapter 8. The heiress who lived after everything that happened, the overdoses, the suicides, the fatal accidents, the fall from a mountain. It's hard not to see the Guinness family as cursed. I mean, at a certain point, it stops feeling like coincidence, right? But then we meet Daphne Guinness. And her story is different, not because it's free of darkness. Oh, no, far from it. Daphne's life starts in the shadow of the same chaos and pain that followed her ancestors. But what makes her different is what she did with it. Let's start at the beginning. When Daphne was just 5 years old, she came terrifyingly close to becoming another victim of the Guinness curse. One day, a man named Tony, a supposed family friend, showed up at the house. He wasn't a stranger. He'd been around before. He was looking for his mother, who happened to be having lunch with Daphne's mom. Totally normal visit until it wasn't. Tony stepped into that house with something else on his mind. Without warning, he pulled out a knife and held it to Daphne's throat. Let that sink in for a second. She was 5. A child. And here was a grown man, someone she had probably seen at dinner parties, pressing a blade to her skin. No one saw it coming. No one could have imagined it. And suddenly the Guinness curse wasn't some abstract, dramatic thing from the past. It was right there in the room, breathing the same air as this little girl. Tony started shouting that he wanted to kill all the women in the family. Daphne's housekeeper, who might be the true unsung hero of this story, intervened. Somehow she distracted him long enough for him to let go and leave. But the horror didn't end there. The very next day, Tony murdered his own mother. Daphne, at 5 years old, had escaped death. Barely. And that moment, it never really left her. She grew up with that memory, that trauma, living quietly under her skin, while the world around her saw only glamour. because by the time she was a young adult, Daphne had stepped fully into the spotlight not as a victim, but as a style icon, a muse, a symbol of modern rebellion. She became deeply embedded in the London fashion scene, close friends with people like Alexander McQueen working with Gucci, and launching her own makeup collaborations with brands like NARS and MAC. Her look completely her own, edgy, haunting high fashion, with a hint of something darker behind the eyes. It was like she was wearing her legacy unapologetically like armor, but unlike so many in her family, Daphne didn't disappear into the shadows. She used her platform to support the arts, to speak up, to be visible. In a family known for secrets, she chose expression. In a legacy marred by tragedy, she chose creation. She once said, "Life is a comedy and tragedy in equal parts." The main thing is to try to pick yourself up and create something worthwhile out of it. And honestly, I don't think I've ever heard a better summary of the Guinness story. Because this family, this empire built on beer, grief, and silence, didn't just give us wealth and scandal, it gave us survivors. And Daphne. She might be the first Guinness in a very long time to stop running from the darkness and start dancing in it. She didn't break the curse. No one can really do that. But maybe, just maybe, she changed the story. And in families like this, that's more powerful than magic. In the final chapter, we'll reflect on the legacy of the Guinness family, how the darkness shaped them, how their wealth couldn't protect them, and how their story continues to echo through generations, just like the pint in your hand. And if you're still wondering whether curses are real, well, just wait. Chapter 9: Legacy, Shadows, and the Price of a Name. So, after everything we've talked about, all the tragedies, the scandals, the whispers of a curse, where does that leave us? What do we do with a story like the Guinness family? I've thought about this a lot, actually, because on the surface it's easy to write them off. Just another wealthy dynasty plagued by their own privilege, another cautionary tale of too much money, too little love. But I think it's more complicated than that. Because the truth is, the Guinness family wasn't just rich. They were rooted in history. Their name is literally part of Irish identity. A pint of Guinness isn't just a drink, it's a symbol. You see it in pubs, on flags, at parades. You see it in art and music, it's cultural. And behind that symbol was a family. A very human, very flawed, very broken family. From Arthur Guinness and his 9,000-year lease, to the potato famine profiteering, to the roaring parties and deadly accidents, all the way to kidnappings and overdoses, this family has lived through everything. Wealth, fame, power, loss. And still, their story isn't finished. Because when a name like Guinness gets this big, it stops being just about bloodlines. It becomes something else. A brand. A legacy. And legacy, as we've seen, doesn't just preserve the good, it traps the bad right alongside it. And honestly, that's the part that sticks with me. Because for every story of success in the Guinness family, there's a shadow. For every toast in a pub, there's a tragedy behind the scenes. For every headline about glamour and elegance, there's someone grieving quietly, unheard, under the weight of expectation. It makes you wonder, what's the true cost of being born into a name that everyone knows, but no one really understands? I also think about the people who didn't make it out: Natalia Henrietta, Caroline Rose John. Their stories were shaped by forces bigger than them: pressure, legacy, addiction, loneliness. And yes, maybe even trauma passed down from one generation to the next. Whether you call that a curse or not, well, that's up to you. But then there's Daphne. And maybe she's the turning point. Maybe she's proof that you don't have to repeat the story you were handed. That survival can look like making art wearing weird clothes, being unapologetically different. Maybe breaking a curse doesn't mean ending tragedy altogether. Maybe it means refusing to let tragedy be the whole story. And I know for most of us, we'll never relate to what it's like to grow up in castles or be followed by paparazzi. But pain, family, dysfunction. That feeling of being trapped by things you didn't choose, that's very human. That part, we get. So the next time someone hands you a pint of Guinness, maybe at a bar, maybe at a wedding, maybe at some random pub with sticky floors and a jukebox that never works, take a second. Remember that it wasn't just brewed in barrels, it was brewed in generations, in history, in both pride and pain, and maybe just maybe in curses. Thanks for sitting with me through this story. I'll see you in the next one. But until then, be kind to your history, because it has a funny way of echoing back. Hey, it's good to see you again. Or if this is your first time here, welcome. Now, let me ask you something. Have you ever looked at a rich, powerful family and thought, wow, they have it all? The money, the connections, the influence. But what if I told you that behind all of that, there's often something much darker? A history that doesn't show up in magazine covers or commercials. Today, we're talking about a family you've definitely heard of, even if you didn't know much about them. The Guinness family. Yes, like the beer. But trust me, this story has nothing to do with brewing and everything to do with grief, scandal, obsession, trauma, and yes, maybe even a curse. Because the Guinness legacy isn't just rich in history, it's soaked in tragedy. So grab a drink, whatever kind you like, and get ready. Because this isn't just a history lesson. This is a warning about what happens when success becomes a prison and when a name becomes something you can't escape. This is True Crime Echoes, and this is the dark history of the Guinness family. If you've made it this far, first of all, thank you. These stories aren't easy to tell, and they're definitely not easy to hear. But I believe they matter. Because behind every tragedy, every so-called curse, there are real people, real pain, and sometimes real silence. The Guinness story echoes across generations not just because of the deaths or the scandals, but because of how familiar it feels. How legacy and trauma can tangle together, how money can buy everything except peace, and how sometimes what looks like a glamorous life hides the deepest kind of emptiness. If you found something meaningful in today's story, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think? Is this just a long streak of misfortune, or is it something more? Until next time, stay curious, stay compassionate, and never stop asking what's hidden just beneath the surface. This is True Crime Echoes. I'll see you in the next story.